A high-pitched scream cracked through the dusty air, followed by a gunshot that shattered a whiskey bottle behind the bar. The piano player ducked. The bartender didn't flinch. And the old man in the corner? He sipped his drink like nothing happened. Outside, a man stumbled through the saloon doors, pants around his ankles, covered in honey and feathers, yelling something about being robbed by a one-legged prostitute named Bonnie Dynamite. Inside Maddie's saloon, the three young bounty hunters laughed so hard one of them fell off his chair, kicking the spittoon across the room. Cactus Creek had seen its fair share of crazy, but today was different. Because the old man everyone laughed at was about to remind the world that legends don't retire, they reload. The trio of bounty hunters swaggered through the saloon like they owned it. Dusty coats, shiny boots, and pistols that had clearly never seen a real fight. They called themselves the Vulture Pack. Reed, a cocky quick-draw with more ego than experience. Jeb, the muscle who once confused a tumbleweed for a fugitive. And Tucker, the brains of the group, which wasn't saying much. They ordered drinks with flair, knocking over a stool just to prove a point. Maddie, the owner and bartender, rolled her eyes and poured their whiskey. In the corner, sitting quietly beneath the mounted skull of a buffalo and a lantern that flickered more out of spite than oil, sat the old cowboy. His boots were cracked, his hat sagged like a tired roof, and his beard looked like it had stories to tell. No one really knew his name. Folks just called him Old Saddlebag. He had the look of a man who'd outlived both time and mercy. Look at him. Reed chuckled, nudging Tucker. Bet he thinks he's Jesse James or something. More like Grandpa James, Tucker quipped, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. Old Saddlebag didn't blink. He just took another sip and muttered something under his breath. Jeb leaned in. What was that, old-timer? The old man's voice was gravel-soaked in bourbon. Said I once buried a man for less than your hat is worth. And I buried his horse too, out of respect. The room went quiet for a beat before the Vulture Pack burst out laughing. Reed grabbed a chair, turned it backwards, and sat in front of the old man like he was interviewing him. You some kind of retired outlaw? He mocked. Let me guess, you robbed a train, fell asleep, and woke up in a nursing home? Old Saddlebag looked him dead in the eye. I once made a Pinkerton agent eat his badge. He thanked me after. More laughter. You boys ever heard of Coyote Jack? Maddie said suddenly from behind the bar, drying a glass with a rag that hadn't been washed since the Civil War. The folk tale? Jeb shrugged. Yeah, he's in those cheap dime novels. Supposed to be some gunslinger who disappeared after the Battle of Burnt Creek. Maddie smirked. Ain't no folk tale. He's real. And he used to drink here. Still might. Reed snorted. What, you saying this sack of bones is Coyote Jack? The room tensed. The old man slowly turned his head toward Maddie. She nodded once, like they were sharing some old, buried truth. Reed stood, brushing off his coat. Yeah, all right. When he starts shooting lightning bolts out of his eyes, let me know. Until then. Hey, what's that? Tucker pointed to something wedged behind the out-of-tune piano. Jeb walked over and yanked it loose. It was a poster. A wanted poster. Old, yellowed, frayed at the corners, but the ink was still clear. The reward? $500,000. The crime? Armed robbery, jailbreak, destruction of federal property, and the disappearance of 3 U.S. Marshals. The name? Coyote Jack. But the picture, that picture chilled the room. It was the old man. Only younger. Darker hair. Same eyes. Same scar under his chin. Jeb's hands trembled. No way. Tucker looked back at the corner. The old man was gone. The front door creaked slowly on its hinge, swinging in the still afternoon heat. The only thing left behind on the table where the old man sat was a single bullet. It was polished, gleaming, and carved into its brass casing were the initials, C.J. Reed lunged out the door, eyes scanning the dusty street. Nothing but a wind-blown tumbleweed and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Back inside, silence gripped the room like a noose. Did we just insult a $500,000 legend? Tucker whispered. He was just here, Jeb stammered. He was right there. Reed stared at the bullet, then at the poster, then at Maddie. Where'd he go? Maddie shrugged, her voice soft but sharp. Where he always goes, where you can't follow unless you're ready to die. Or worse. The Vulture Pack didn't sleep that night. They sat around a table in the back of the saloon, poster laid flat between their drinks. Tucker traced the words with a shaky finger. Jeb cleaned his gun 3 times. Reed stared into the lamp flame like it might blink back. By morning, they'd made a decision. They weren't just bounty hunters anymore. They were chasing a ghost. A living legend with a bounty higher than any they'd ever seen. But Coyote Jack wasn't running. He was leading. And the hunt had only just begun. The sun rose over Cactus Creek with the kind of lazy indifference that made men question whether they should chase glory or just go back to bed. For the Vulture Pack, sleep hadn't been much of an option. The old man's sudden disappearance, and that eerie bullet with the carved initials had sunk into their bones like a bad chill. By the time the first rooster crowed, Reed, Jeb, and Tucker were already saddled up and riding out of town, the wanted poster rolled and stuffed into Reed's coat. They didn't know where they were going exactly, but they figured if they started down the only road heading west, they'd eventually catch up to the man who once made a Pinkerton agent eat his badge. The trail began calm enough. Birds chirped, the breeze was cool, and Jeb was humming a song he probably learned from a drunk. But it wasn't long before the road turned strange. At first it was little things, boot prints in the dirt that seemed to vanish after a few feet, a campfire still warm with no sign of who lit it, and cigarette butts made from old Confederate currency. Tucker, ever the thinker, noted that the butts were still smoldering when they found them. Jack wasn't ahead of them by much. But he was making it clear, he saw them first. They passed an overturned wagon with its wheels still spinning. Inside, a crate of apples had been torn open and scattered. But there wasn't a single bite taken. Just a message carved into the side of the wood, turn back. Reed spat and muttered something about mind games. Jeb looked visibly nervous but said nothing. Tucker scribbled it into his little leather notebook, like it might mean something later. They rode on, more tense with every mile. At midday, they stopped at a crossroads near a watering hole called Crooked Jaw Spring. That's where they met the strangest man they'd ever seen, a snake oil peddler named Elwood who claimed his elixir could cure rattlesnake bites, heartbreak, and tax debt. He had a handlebar mustache that could house birds and eyes that blinked in opposite directions. When asked if he'd seen an old man pass through, Elwood nodded sagely and said, "Sure did. Gave me a coin and said to tell the next 3 fools that follow him this. If they ain't ghosts yet, they will be soon." Jeb asked if he still had the coin. Elwood grinned and pulled it out from under his hat. It was gold. Federal Mint. Date stamped 1849. Reed reached for it. Elwood pulled it back. "You can have it," he said, "but only if you buy a bottle of my miracle tonic." Reed swatted it away, irritated, but Tucker quietly paid the man, took the bottle, and pocketed the coin. Elwood tipped his hat and wandered off humming a funeral tune, leaving behind the faint smell of gunpowder and mint. They followed the trail until sunset, reaching a canyon with cliffs that bled red as the sky darkened. Locals called it Widow's Peak, named after the dozen or so miners and bounty men who fell off the ledges chasing dreams or running from debts. They made camp at the base, lit a fire, and sat quietly, each man pretending not to be afraid. But it was in the silence that Widow's Peak lived up to its name. Tucker woke up first. Or rather, he noticed first. Jeb was gone. His bedroll was there. His gun was there. Even his half-eaten biscuit was still warm. But no Jeb. Not a sound. Not a scream. Just a faint whistle of wind rolling down the canyon walls. Reed jumped to his feet, eyes wide, scanning the shadows. They searched the area, torches held high. All they found were Jeb's boots, placed side by side, neatly, like he had stepped out of them and floated away. There was no blood. No struggle. No footprints. Just silence. Tucker looked at Reed. "He's messing with us." Reed didn't answer. They packed up camp at first light and continued up the canyon trail, now 2 instead of 3. Tension thickened between them, each blaming the other in silence. Reed wanted to turn back, but pride wouldn't let him. Tucker was in too deep, curiosity burning through his nerves. They rode in silence, both haunted by the missing man and the realization that they were no longer on a manhunt. They were being tested. By mid-afternoon, they came across a strange formation in the canyon, rocks stacked like towers, each one topped with a tin star from a lawman's badge. One tower had a badge cracked in half, with something carved into the rock beneath it. The Regulators Die Hard. Tucker knew the name. The Regulators had been a short-lived, vigilante-style law group wiped out in a political purge years ago. Most of their stories were suppressed or turned into legends. But now, with the cracked badge in his hand, Tucker realized they were never myths. Jack had been one of them. They stopped to rest near a cliff edge where they were greeted by a sudden hail of rocks from above. Reed dove for cover, cursing. Tucker rolled behind a fallen tree. But nothing followed. Just the echo of their own panic. Then, a voice echoed down the canyon walls, calm and clear. "You boys lost?" Reed stood up, scanning wildly. "Show yourself!" "I already have. You just didn't recognize me." They spun in every direction, but there was no one. Only wind. Only rocks. Only the creeping realization that they were miles from civilization and utterly under someone else's control. That night, they didn't set a fire. Didn't talk. Just lay with guns drawn and eyes open, staring into the dark, wondering if they'd see the sunrise or just wake up to find themselves barefoot and vanish like Jeb. By morning they found hoofprints circling their camp. Deep. Fresh. But no rider in sight. Just another bullet stuck into the trunk of a nearby tree. Another one with those cursed initials carved into the side. CJ. Tucker turned to Reed, his face pale. "He's not running." Reed nodded, for once without a smart remark. "He's leading us." And so, 2 bounty hunters rode on, through a land of ghosts and messages carved in wood and bullets. No longer hunters. Just men tangled in a web spun by someone far smarter, far older, and far more dangerous than any dime novel outlaw they'd ever read about. And behind every rock, every gust of wind, every shifting shadow, they couldn't help but feel he was watching. Not hiding. Waiting. The morning fog rolled in like a slow curse, thick and quiet, cloaking the red canyons in an eerie hush that made every rock and ridge feel like a set of watching eyes. Reed and Tucker had gone nearly a day without speaking, each locked in his own thoughts, both weighed down by the memory of Jeb's empty boots and the growing realization that this was no ordinary chase. The trail led them deeper into a stretch of land known only as the Broken Batch. The maps didn't name it, the locals didn't mention it, and even the wind seemed reluctant to blow there. But the signs were clear. Coyote Jack had come this way. And he wanted them to follow. Around noon, they crossed a ravine filled with shattered timbers and rusted steel, remains of an old train that had derailed years ago, its twisted metal now a nest for buzzards. Reed paused to look over the wreck, then noticed something that made him grip his revolver a little tighter. Hanging from a bent rail spike was a tattered flag stitched with the symbol of the Regulators. Below it, someone had scrawled a message in charcoal on the steel, still writing. The handwriting was jagged, fast, and unmistakably his. Jack wasn't just leaving a trail, he was leaving proof. They pressed on until the canyons widened and gave way to a rocky plateau where the wind blew harder and the ground showed signs of hooves. Not just one set, several. Reed dropped to one knee and ran his fingers across the prints. These weren't fresh. They were layered, years apart, different sizes. It was like this place had been used for gatherings. Tucker pointed to a circle of stones, blackened by old fires. Dozens of them. Not a single one cold. Someone had been keeping them warm, one after another. Reed's voice was barely a whisper. "He's not alone." That's when they heard it, a distant shot, sharp and sudden, bouncing off the canyon walls. Instinct took over. They drew weapons and dropped behind a boulder. Silence returned just as quickly as the sound had arrived, but it left behind a ripple of dread. They waited, breath held, ears straining. Nothing. Then a voice, faint but distinct, floated on the wind. Not Jack's. A woman's. About time you showed up. Reed and Tucker exchanged glances, then slowly approached the direction of the voice, weapons still drawn. They found her leaning against a rock outcropping, rifle slung casually over one shoulder, chewing on a sprig of grass like it owed her money. She looked like trouble dressed in leather and patience. Her eyes were sharp and tired at the same time. Clarabelle. That was the name she gave, no last name offered. She said she used to ride with the regulators, back when they had rules and a cause. Now, she was the last one left. The last one still loyal. Clarabelle didn't ask what they were doing there. She already knew. Instead, she lit a cigarette and told them a story. About the town of Burnt Creek, the government's betrayal, and how Jack watched his brothers-in-arms get gunned down by the very marshals they'd once worked beside. He was supposed to die that day. Instead, he vanished. Took to the hills. And since then, he'd been hunting not for gold, not for glory, but for justice. A different kind of justice. The kind they don't print in books. The kind that writes its own laws. Tucker listened, nodding slowly, as if the puzzle pieces were finally clicking together. Reed didn't say much, just kept glancing over his shoulder, nervous. Clarabelle offered them a choice: leave now and forget the whole damn thing, or follow her to a place called the Bone Ledger. That's where Jack was headed. That's where it would all come to a head. They chose to follow. The Bone Ledger wasn't a town. It wasn't even on a map. It was a crumbling outpost hidden in a canyon shaped like a ribcage, with rusted fences and signs that had long since lost their words. It used to be a bounty exchange, a place where names were sold like cattle, justice auctioned to the highest bidder. It was Judge Malrick's territory now, a man so crooked he once arrested a priest for praying too loudly. Malrick was the one who put the bounty on Jack's head. And now, Jack was coming for him. They arrived at the outskirts of the outpost just before nightfall. From their vantage point, they could see mercenaries in wide-brimmed hats patrolling the grounds, all heavily armed, most looking like they'd shoot their own mother for $1. Clarabelle outlined the plan. There was a delivery wagon scheduled for the next morning, bringing bribe money for Malrick's next auction. They'd hijack it, ride in disguise, and cause enough chaos to give Jack a clean shot at Malrick. Reed had his doubts, but he knew they'd come too far to turn back. But Jack didn't wait for morning. At midnight the ground shook with the blast of dynamite. The western gate of Bone Ledger exploded in a fireball, and through the smoke rode a man on a black horse, cloak flapping like wings, pistols in both hands, eyes locked straight ahead. Coyote Jack. Alive, furious, and moving like the ghost of war itself. Bullets flew in every direction. Mercenaries scrambled. Reed and Tucker had no choice but to dive in, guns blazing. Clarabelle sniped from the ridge, dropping men with surgical precision. Jack was a force of nature. He moved through the chaos with a strange calm, as if he already knew every bullet's path, every man's mistake before they made it. He didn't speak. He didn't pause. He just carved a trail through corruption until he stood face to face with Malrick in the heart of the old auction house. Reed and Tucker followed him inside, bloodied and breathless, in time to see Jack shove Malrick against the wall. The judge tried to bargain, to weasel his way out with words and gold. Jack listened, then handed him a piece of paper. A bounty. Malrick's own name at the top. Signed by the ghost of the regulators. Then Jack walked away. Clarabelle lit the last fuse as they exited. The explosion ripped through the Bone Ledger, collapsing the roof and burying the auction house in rubble. No screams. No gunfire. Just silence again. They rode until dawn. No words. Just the sun rising over a cleaner piece of land. Clarabelle vanished into the hills. Jack turned to Reed and Tucker and handed them a folded poster. It was blank on one side. On the other, it had one sentence. This time, you decide who's worth chasing. And then he was gone. The morning sun crept slowly over the hills, dragging with it the smoke from the ruins of the Bone Ledger. The air still held the bitter taste of gunpowder and fire, but it was quiet now. Too quiet. No hoofbeats. No shouting. No echo of chaos. Just the wind brushing across ash and scorched earth. Reed sat on a rock at the edge of the canyon, cradling a flask he couldn't bring himself to drink from, staring at the blackened remains of a system that had thrived on blood and fear. Tucker stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, staring at the folded poster Jack had given them. Either of them had slept. Neither had spoken more than a few words since the explosion. Everything felt heavier now. Not just their limbs or their wounds, but their thoughts, their memories, their roles in all of it. They didn't know where Jack had gone after the fire. One moment he was walking into the light like a man who'd finished a job he waited decades to complete, and the next he was gone. No trail. No sign. Not even a fresh boot print. Just like that, the old cowboy vanished again. But he'd left something behind. Not just the poster. Not just the fire. But a choice. A question that neither Reed nor Tucker had ever stopped long enough to ask themselves. What kind of men are we really? They rode south in silence, away from Bone Ledger, toward nothing in particular. They passed towns that looked too clean, where folks didn't ask questions and eyes followed them from behind curtains. They avoided saloons. They stopped shaving. They stopped chasing bounties. The world felt different now. Like once you'd looked behind the curtain, you couldn't unsee what was there. They tried to act normal. Took on a few odd jobs. Guarded a shipment for a general store. Helped a widow fix her barn roof. But it all felt hollow, like wearing someone else's boots. In the small town of Dry Needle, they found Clarabelle again. She was leaning against the jailhouse wall, flipping a coin and looking like she'd never left the canyon. She didn't say much, just gave them a nod and handed Tucker a newspaper. The headline hit like a punch to the chest. Judge Malrick confirmed dead, body identified in Bone Ledger ruins. Underneath was a short blurb about a new federal investigation into bounty corruption and an anonymous tip that sparked the inquiry. Jack had done it. Not just with bullets and fire, but with proof. He hadn't just burned the system down. He'd planted the seeds for something better. Or at least something less rotten. Clarabelle left again before sundown, muttering something about needing to check on a friend up north who might still owe her money or a bullet. Tucker asked if they'd see her again. She shrugged and walked off without answering. That night, Reed finally took a sip from his flask, winced, and said, "We can't go back to who we were." Tucker just nodded. A week later, in a dusty outpost called Brim Hollow, they heard whispers. Men at the bar talking about a new bounty board, one that didn't offer rewards for men accused without trial, one run by people who weren't in it for profit. The whole idea sounded ridiculous. But then the bartender showed them something. A new kind of wanted poster. Handmade. Ink still fresh. It didn't offer money. It didn't list crimes. It just said one thing: wanted, men with honor. Beneath it was a signature. CJ. They stared at it for a long time. Reed rubbed his jaw and let out a dry chuckle. "He's building something, ain't he?" Tucker folded the poster carefully and put it in his coat pocket beside the old one. "Not something. Someone." Over the next few weeks, they followed those posters. They weren't placed in big towns or on official boards. They were nailed to trees, stuck to the back doors of saloons, slipped under the plates at diners where ex-lawmen worked as cooks. And each time, there'd be a small gathering nearby. A meeting. Quiet. Careful. Men and women talking about justice without badges. Protection without price. Honor without lawbooks. It wasn't an army. Not yet. But it was growing. One night, camped near an old mining trail, Reed pulled out his revolver and stared at it like it was a relic. "I used to think we were the good guys," he said. "Chasing the bad, getting paid, doing right. Thought the poster told the truth." Tucker added another log to the fire and sat down across from him. "We believed the words. Not the hands writing them." Reed holstered his gun and looked up. "You think Jack's still watching?" Tucker nodded slowly. "I think he's everywhere. watching the ones who listen, testing the ones who follow. A silence passed between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then Reed stood and unrolled the original poster they found back in Cactus Creek, the one with Jack's younger face and the $500,000 bounty. He stared at it for a long moment, then tossed it into the fire. The flames curled the edges, twisted the paper, and finally consumed it. No one said a word. Days turned into weeks, and the legend of Coyote Jack only grew. Some said he was forming a new regulators group. Others said he'd left for Mexico, or rode into the mountains to die alone. A few swore they saw him on the edge of battlefields, whispering into the ears of those about to make a choice. But the ones who really knew understood the truth. Jack was never a man you found. He was the line you crossed, or refused to. He was the question you had to answer when no one was watching. Eventually, Reed and Tucker found their way back to Cactus Creek. Maddie's saloon hadn't changed much. Same creaky door, same crooked piano. The skull above the bar had a new hat on it, courtesy of some joker with a sense of humor. They ordered drinks and sat in the same corner where Jack once sat, back when they thought he was just an old fool with too many stories. Tucker pulled out a pen and started scribbling on a napkin. Reed leaned over. "What are you doing?" "Writing a name," Tucker said. "In case someone ever asks who we were." Reed smiled, finished his drink, and dropped a bullet on the table. Not polished. Not carved. Just clean and ready. Because the truth was simple. They weren't bounty hunters anymore. They were riding for something else now. And somewhere out there, Coyote Jack was smiling. The desert wind carried with it a strange stillness, the kind that settles right before a storm or right after a man makes a choice he can't undo. Weeks had passed since Reed and Tucker returned to Cactus Creek, but something about the town felt different now. Not on the surface. The saloons still smelled like spilled whiskey and regret, the sheriff still snored in his office chair, and the general store still had more dust than goods. But underneath, like the ground was shifting, like the old bones of the West were rearranging themselves in the dirt. Every now and then, someone would ride into town asking the same quiet question in hushed tones. Where can a man go if he wants to do right but doesn't trust the badge? And each time, the locals would glance toward the saloon, where two former bounty hunters sat like bookends to a new story waiting to be written. Reed had stopped wearing his revolver on his hip. He kept it, of course, but now it stayed inside his saddlebag, beside a collection of old maps, a worn-out notebook, and a folded piece of paper that simply read "Wanted, Men with Honor." Tucker had started writing more, scribbling names and places into his notebook, drawing lines between towns and events, trying to piece together where the next spark might catch fire. They weren't following Coyote Jack anymore. They were laying down the path for him, one honest decision at a time. Then one night, the spark found them. It came in the form of a young woman with blood on her shirt and fear in her eyes. She stumbled into the saloon, collapsing near their table before she even said a word. Tucker caught her just before she hit the floor, and Reed waved Maddie over for water. The girl was barely 20, arms scraped, lips split, but her hands clutched a satchel like it held her soul. She didn't speak until the saloon emptied out, until Maddie locked the doors and pulled the curtains shut. "They're coming," she whispered. "Marshals. Not the good kind." She opened the satchel and poured out its contents, a stack of sealed letters, government-marked documents, and a ledger with Judge Malrick's name at the top. Not just his name. Dozens of names. Politicians. Lawmen. Bounty heads. Payments. Deals. A system. Proof. The girl said her name was Elsie, and her father had worked for Malrick's office as a clerk. When the bone ledger fell, her father tried to come clean, but someone silenced him before he could. She'd been running ever since. And now the people who had propped Malrick up, the ones who didn't die in the explosion, wanted the papers back. And her gone. Reed didn't hesitate. He grabbed the ledger, flipped through the pages, and saw everything they'd suspected written in ink. Bounties for men who never stood trial. Executions paid for in coin. Jack wasn't just a myth anymore. He was the antidote to a disease no one else had been willing to name. Tucker took the satchel, secured it under the floorboard near the bar, and told Elsie she was safe now. She didn't cry, but her shoulders shook like a woman who'd been running so long she forgot what stillness felt like. That night the town changed. 3 riders appeared just after midnight, dressed in long coats and badges that looked official but weren't. Their horses were sleek, their guns clean, their questions sharp. They knocked on the sheriff's door, but the sheriff didn't answer. Whether he was too drunk or just knew better, no one ever found out. So the men came to the saloon. Reed met them outside with his arms crossed and his voice calm. Tucker stood behind the bar with a shotgun just in case the talk turned sour. The lead rider, a man with a scar that split his lip and eyes like burnt coal, said they were looking for a fugitive girl with stolen property. Said they had authority from the new district judge. Said it like a threat, like the badge gave him permission to kill whoever looked at him wrong. Reed didn't blink. He simply said she wasn't there. The man smiled like a man who enjoyed hurting people and said they'd check anyway. That was when Clarabelle stepped out of the shadows. No one had seen her ride in. No one heard her horse. She just appeared, rifle over her shoulder, voice low and steady. "No one checks unless I say so." The 3 riders turned, guns twitching. Reed didn't move. Tucker cocked the shotgun. Clarabelle took 1 step forward and added, "This town's off the list. You want trouble? I got enough bullets for a sermon." The riders hesitated. Then they left. Not because they were scared, but because they were smart enough to realize they weren't dealing with sheep. They were dealing with wolves who'd chosen not to bite. Yet. The next day, Elsie left with Clarabelle, headed north to a hidden town where the regulators were said to be regrouping, this time under new rules, cleaner hands, and eyes wide open. She took the ledger. Reed and Tucker took her trust. It was a trade both sides were glad to make. More weeks passed. The saloon became a different kind of place. Not quieter, Mattie would never allow that, but wiser. Riders came and went with nods instead of threats. Names were spoken with care. Reed started teaching kids how to shoot, not for violence, but for discipline. Tucker started mailing copies of The Wanted, Men with Honor poster to towns 3 counties over. No one told them what to do. They just did what felt right. Like Jack had passed the torch without saying a word. Then one morning, a new poster appeared nailed to the front of the saloon. No one saw who put it there. No one heard the hammer or saw the horse. But there it was. A fresh poster. This one different. This one said, "No reward? No justice left unpaid." And at the bottom, in bold, angry strokes, "The reckoning rides." Reed read it 3 times. Tucker said nothing. Clarabelle, who just happened to be sipping coffee nearby, grinned and said, "Well, looks like he's not done yet." They didn't know where Jack was. Didn't know what storm he was heading toward. But they knew one thing without question. If he called, they'd ride. Not for the money. Not for revenge. But because honor, once you've found it, doesn't let you rest easy. Because the West wasn't done writing its story. And some pages still needed the ink of men who'd learned the difference between chasing justice and becoming it. So Reed strapped his revolver back on. Tucker packed the notebook. Clarabelle loaded her rifle. And as the sun rose over Cactus Creek once more, they saddled up. 3 riders. No badges. No orders. Just a cause. And far off in the distance, somewhere just beyond the horizon, the legend of Coyote Jack waited. Or maybe he watched. Either way, they were coming.